Olivia Marshall had worked tirelessly for 4 years to earn her degree. It had been 4 long years of living off of ramen noodles, coffee, and very little sleep. She should have been over the moon that she made it, yet when she held that diploma in her hands, she felt nothing but uncertainty. The structured world of academia had ended, and now she was left with the daunting question of what came next. To clear her mind and find direction, Olivia decided to embark on a solo backpacking trip. She had been an avid hiker since childhood, and nature always gave her a sense of peace and clarity. After nearly a month of careful planning, she chose a 45-mile route through the Cascade Mountains in Washington, a trail that would take her deep into the wilderness. Her plan was to hike alone for the first week, and then meet her friend, Rachel, at a designated point to finish the journey together. Her parents, though nervous about her being alone, recognized that her mind was made up. They reluctantly wished her well and gave her a hug goodbye. With her plans in place, Olivia set out, excited for the adventure ahead. As luck would have it, the early June temperatures were still fairly cool, which would make the strenuous hike slightly less taxing. The first few days were everything she had hoped for: breathtaking scenery, the soothing sounds of nature, and time alone with her thoughts. Being surrounded by nature, away from the stresses of modern life, her worries lessened and her mind began to clear. For the first couple of nights, she camped just off the trail, her campsite hidden from view by thick ferns and towering evergreens. She loved the stillness of the night, a stillness broken only by the sounds of coyotes howling in the distance and the scurry of small nocturnal animals going about their nightly activities. However, by the third morning, something had changed. Instead of the peace of mind she'd experienced over the last few days, she awoke with an inexplicable sense of unease. There was a feeling in the pit of her stomach she couldn't rationalize. As she packed up her tent, she nervously glanced at the surrounding trees and felt, for the first time, that she wasn't alone. As she scanned the woods, she saw someone, standing behind a tree roughly 40 feet away. It was just a glimpse, a shadow of a figure, but as soon as she focused, it was gone. Her pulse quickened. She told herself it was nothing to be concerned about. After all, this was a somewhat popular area, and the weather was absolutely perfect for hiking. It was quite likely another backpacker that had passed by and didn't want to disturb her. Still, as she set off on the trail, that uneasy feeling of being watched lingered. She hiked quickly, her nerves on edge, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. Every so often, she glanced over her shoulder, convinced she would see someone there, but the trail remained empty. She tried to shake the paranoia. Maybe she was just spooking herself, letting her overactive imagination get the better of her. But as the hours passed, the feeling of being followed intensified. At one point, she swore she heard footsteps, steady, deliberate, matching her pace. She stopped abruptly and turned, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. An ominous silence seemed to hang in the air, enveloping her in a cold blanket of fear. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. As she moved on, she began to see small, unsettling details that she hadn't noticed before. There was a pile of rocks stacked deliberately near the trail, and long claw-like marks carved into the bark of several trees. It was as if something had been marking its territory. Before long, the air grew thick, suffocating, and heavy. Every instinct she had screamed at her to leave. By the late afternoon, her nerves were completely frayed. She pushed on, needing to get to the next checkpoint where she could rest and hopefully see other hikers. But she couldn't shake the growing certainty that someone, or something, was following her. That night, Olivia set up camp far off the trail, hoping that if someone was following her, they wouldn't find her easily. She built a small fire, needing the comfort of the light and warmth from the flames. As the sun set and darkness enveloped the woods, she heard it again, those heavy, deliberate footsteps circling her campsite. Her heart pounded. She clutched her knife and strained to hear. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural grunt, almost human, but distorted. Her breath hitched. She stayed still, gripping the knife until her hand ached. The footsteps moved closer. She couldn't see anything beyond the fire's glow, but she could no longer deny that something was out there. The flames flickered, casting shifting shadows between the trees, and then a shape moved. A hunched figure just beyond the light of the fire, too large to be a person, too human-like to be an animal. Its breathing was heavy and labored. Olivia dared not move. The thing let out a slow, wheezing exhale before retreating into the blackness of the trees. She desperately wanted to run out of the park, but at the same time, she was too terrified to move. After about a half hour, with no more movement from the shadows, Olivia crawled back into her tent. She barely slept, every rustling leaf making her jolt awake. At first light, she packed up in a frenzy and set off, moving as fast as she could. She had planned to continue on the trail, but now she had only one goal: find a road and get out of the mountains. She estimated there was a highway a few miles west, but reaching it meant leaving the trail and descending through dense, unmarked wilderness. It was risky, but the fear of whatever was stalking her outweighed the danger of getting lost. She turned off the path and began bushwhacking through the heavy undergrowth of ferns and poison oak. The deeper into the forest she went, the more disoriented she became. The trees seemed to close in around her as panic began to set in. Then the sounds returned. Footsteps, the snapping of branches, that low grunting noise. Olivia ran as fast as the undergrowth allowed, mindless of the branches tearing at her arms and face. She didn't know how long she had been traveling when she stumbled upon something chilling, a small, makeshift shelter made of sticks and leaves. Nearby, animal bones were scattered in a rough pile. Her breath came in short gasps. Someone was living out here, and she was on their land, right at their front door. Panicked and sick with terror, she made the rash decision to ditch her pack. It was slowing her down, and she needed to move faster. She abandoned her food, water, and supplies and ran with everything she had. The forest blurred around her as she pushed through the dense foliage, her lungs on fire as she frantically gasped for air. The pursuit didn't stop. The sounds grew bolder. The grunting turned into what sounded like whispered words, unintelligible, guttural, almost mocking. Shadows danced between the trees, just out of sight. At one point, she collapsed, frantically gasping for breath, only to hear a sharp intake of air from just behind her. She didn't dare look back. With no other choice, she forced herself up and kept moving. Hours passed, the sun dipped low, and exhaustion overtook her. She collapsed against a tree, her throat dry, her body trembling. She had no idea where she was. As night fell, she forced herself to stay awake, clutching a branch as a makeshift weapon. The sounds returned, closer than ever. Heavy footsteps circling her, the grunting, now almost a whisper, repeating her name. No, how? How could this person or thing possibly know her name? She squeezed her eyes shut and fervently prayed for morning. When dawn finally broke, Olivia forced herself up and continued moving. She had no direction, no supplies, only raw survival instinct. Days blurred together. She drank from streams, ate wild berries, and moved endlessly, always pursued by that unseen presence. Then, on the 22nd day, she stumbled upon something surreal. A plastic container wedged inside a hollowed-out tree. Inside were stale donuts and pound cake. She had no idea who put them there or why, but she devoured them. It gave her just enough energy to keep going. On the 24th day, a hunter found her. Olivia was slumped against a tree, dehydrated and delirious. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her skin scratched and bruised. At first she panicked, thinking he was her pursuer. But when she saw the concern in his eyes, she let herself collapse in relief. He took her to safety, where she was hospitalized and rehydrated. When she recounted her story, no one knew what to make of it. Park rangers were skeptical. There were no other reported hikers in the area, and no missing persons matching her description of the figure she saw. There were whispers that she'd suffered a mental breakdown. Others speculated she had been stalked by a reclusive survivalist. Local legends told of feral people living deep in the mountains, but no one had any concrete answers. To this day, Olivia doesn't know what was chasing her. In spite of other people's doubts, she knows that she was not alone in those woods. Something, or someone, was hunting her and continues to stalk her through her nightmares. Jack and Eric had spent years chasing legends. As self-proclaimed cryptid hunters, they had followed every rumor, every blurry video, every shaky witness account of Bigfoot sightings across the country. Sadly, most turned out to be hoaxes or misidentifications, but the two men firmly believed that the truth was out there. And now, deep within the dense forests of Black Pine National Park, they thought they had finally found it. Armed with rifles, night vision cameras, and their audio recording equipment, the two men set out into the wilderness, excited to investigate every clue. They followed a series of deep, seemingly inhuman tracks through the underbrush, the chill of the early autumn night setting in around them. Eric checked the GPS. We're about 6 miles from base camp. If we don't find anything by sunrise, we'll head back. Jackson nodded in agreement, adjusting the strap of his rifle. If we don't find anything, I'll be shocked. Something's been watching us since we got here. You feel it too, don't you? Eric had felt it, even if he wasn't ready to admit it yet. A constant, prickling awareness on the back of his neck. A presence. Could be our imagination, he countered, in a fruitless attempt to convince himself. At that moment, a distant howl echoed through the trees. It clearly wasn't a wolf. It wasn't any animal they had ever heard before. Deep, resonant, almost mournful. Jackson pulled out his recorder, whispering, "We are hearing an unidentified vocalization at 11:32 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Possible Sasquatch communication." A couple of minutes later, there came another howl. This one was closer. Much closer. "Did you see that?" Eric swung his flashlight into the trees. The dim light caught a movement between the trunks, massive and fast. His stomach twisted in trepidation. "Did you see that?" he whispered, turning to his friend. Eyes wide, Jackson nodded slowly. "Yeah, we're not alone." Nervous but intrigued, they pressed forward, cautiously weaving their way through the underbrush. The night grew darker, the trees closing in, their branches like skeletal fingers against the midnight sky. Another sound filtered through the trees, this one different. Not a howl, but a rhythmic clicking, like rocks being struck together. Then another howl reverberated through the forest. Then another, louder, closer. "Holy crap! They're surrounding us." The realization hit Jackson first. Eric cursed under his breath. "We need to get back." Seconds later, the forest exploded with movement. Branches snapped, flying through the air. Heavy footfalls thundered from every direction. Shadows shifted, huge and hulking, closing in fast. Jackson raised his rifle, heart hammering. "We see you. Back off." To his dismay, his warning sounded like more of a plea than a command. A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the trees. Not the sound of a frightened animal, but something else, something intelligent. And then the first one stepped into view. It was enormous. 8 feet tall at least, its body covered in thick matted fur. Its eyes, black and reflective, locked onto them with unmistakable intent. It wasn't running. It wasn't fleeing. It was hunting. And they were the prey. Eric fired first. The rifle's crack shattered the night, the bullet striking the creature in the shoulder. Though blood ran down his matted fur, the monster barely flinched. "Run!" Jackson shouted the warning as much to himself as his friend. They bolted, crashing through the underbrush, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest around them was alive with movement, branches shaking, footsteps pounding. More of them. They weren't chasing aimlessly. They were driving them, hurting them. "They're pushing us somewhere." Eric gasped. "They're working together." A deafening roar erupted behind them. Jackson dared a glance back, and regretted it instantly. There were at least 5 of the creatures now, their massive silhouettes weaving through the trees with terrifying speed and agility. Their predatory eyes gleamed in the darkness. The men burst into a small clearing, stumbling to a halt. A massive, gaping pit yawned before them, deep, lined with sharpened wooden stakes. A trap. Eric turned just in time to see the largest of the creatures lunge. A massive arm swung, striking Jackson and sending him sprawling. His rifle skidded away. Eric raised his gun, but another creature was already on him, slamming him to the ground with bone-crushing force. Jackson scrambled backward, his head swimming, his vision blurred. The leader crouched over him, its breath hot and rancid. Jackson's stomach lurched, perhaps in fear, perhaps at the creature's putrid breath. The creature leaned over him, watching him, its head tilting in an eerily human way. Then it spoke. Not in words, not exactly, but in a series of deep, resonant clicks and growls. The others responded in kind. A conversation, more clicking. A decision had been reached. Eric groaned beside him, barely conscious. Jackson tried to reach for his knife, but the creature placed one massive hand on his chest, pinning him down as if he weighed no more than a small rodent. Then, one by one, they stepped back, vanishing into the trees, leaving only their leader. It held Jackson's gaze a moment longer before rising to its full, monstrous height. It let out a low, warning growl, its gleaming black eyes narrowed in anger. And then, it was gone. Jackson lay there, trembling, the night swallowing the creatures completely. A heavy silence fell over the forest once more. It was a silence that whispered of power, of dominance, of mercy. The 2 men had been spared, not because they weren't prey, but because they weren't worth the hunt. Please help us grow and hit the subscribe button.